I'm Daniel. I'm 61 years old. And last year, my own son laughed in my face like I was some kind of joke. Like everything I'd built, everything I'd learned, everything I'd sacrificed for 43 years meant absolutely nothing to him. That laugh, cold, dismissive, cruel, it didn't just hurt. It ignited something in me that I thought had died with my wife 3 years ago. But before I tell you how that laugh changed everything, how it lit a fire in me that burned away every excuse, every comfort zone, every reason to stay quiet and fade away, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what I'm about to share with you isn't just my story. It's proof that they can count you out, they can dismiss you, they can treat you like yesterday's news, they can write your obituary while you're still breathing, but they can't stop you from showing them exactly what the old guard is still capable of when we stop asking for permission and start taking action. You want to know who I am? Really know me? I'm a retired engineer, but that word, retired, tastes like poison in my mouth now. 43 years I spent building things that mattered. Real things. Solid things. Things you can touch and trust and depend on when everything else falls apart. I designed the Morrison Bridge that carries 50,000 cars a day across the Columbia River. I engineered the backup power systems for 3 nuclear facilities that have never failed, not once, in 25 years of operation. I was the guy they called at 3 in the morning when a construction crane collapsed in downtown Portland, when a water main explosion threatened to flood half of Seattle, when an earthquake cracked the foundation of a 40-story office building and everyone needed to know if it was safe. I understood steel and concrete and the physics that hold our world together when everyone else was chasing digital dreams and virtual realities. I knew how to calculate load-bearing capacity and stress fractures and the exact point where materials fail under pressure. I could look at blueprints and see the problems that wouldn't show up until year 15, when the foundation started to settle or the joints began to wear or the thermal expansion finally caught up with the original design flaws. My wife Sarah used to joke that I could fix anything except my relationship with our son Eric. God, she wasn't wrong. Even when she was dying, even in those final weeks when the cancer was eating her alive from the inside out, she kept trying to get Eric and me to talk. Really talk. Not the superficial updates about weather and work, but the deep conversations about dreams and fears and what we meant to each other. You're both too stubborn for your own good, she whispered to me one night, her voice barely audible over the hum of the oxygen machine. He's more like you than either of you wants to admit. That's why you clash so hard. But I couldn't see it then. All I could see was this stranger who happened to share my DNA, this young man who spoke in acronyms and buzzwords and seemed to think that 43 years of engineering experience was quaint and outdated. After Sarah passed, the silence between Eric and me got so thick you could cut it with a welding torch. He was busy building his tech empire, pulling down revenue numbers that made my old engineering salary look like pocket change, and I was just existing. Collecting my pension checks. Watching the world speed past me like I was standing still on a highway while everyone else raced toward a future I couldn't understand. Eric runs this hot tech firm now, TechFlow Solutions. 34 years old and pulling in 8-figure annual revenue that would make your head spin. Venture capital darling, keynote speaker at conferences, featured on magazine covers with headlines like, The Disruptor's Disruptor, and, How One Millennial is Revolutionizing Enterprise Software. Everyone calls him a visionary, an innovator, all those buzzwords they throw around like confetti at a parade nobody invited me to. And me? To him, I'm outdated hardware. A relic from the analog age who doesn't understand that everything is cloud-based and AI-powered and agile now. He looks at me the way you'd look at a rotary phone in an iPhone store, with a mixture of nostalgia and pity, wondering how anyone ever got anything done with such primitive tools. The breaking point came at his company's annual dinner last December. Some fancy restaurant downtown called Meridian where they probably charge $50 for a piece of fish the size of my thumb and call it sustainable cuisine. The kind of place where the waiters wear designer jeans that cost more than my monthly grocery budget and explain each dish like they're unveiling a work of art. I'd been watching his business from the sidelines for months, reading their press releases and case studies, trying to understand what they actually did beyond the marketing speak. And I started seeing cracks. Fundamental problems that nobody else wanted to acknowledge because acknowledging them would mean admitting that maybe, just maybe, some old-school engineering principles still mattered in this brave new digital world. Their platform was growing fast, too fast. They were adding new features every week, scaling up servers, onboarding clients at a pace that made my engineers' instincts scream warnings. Because I knew what happens when you prioritize speed over stability, when you build without proper foundations, when you assume that duct tape and good intentions can hold a skyscraper together. So I thought, stupidly, naively, with the kind of hope that only a father can have for his son, that maybe I could help. Maybe I could offer some perspective from someone who'd actually built things that lasted. Maybe this could be the bridge between us that Sarah had always wanted. I had this idea. Simple, practical, born from decades of watching systems fail in predictable ways. Their architecture was like a house of cards, impressive to look at, but one strong wind would bring the whole thing down. I wanted to suggest redundancy systems, fail-safes, the kind of boring but essential infrastructure that keeps bridges from falling and power plants from exploding. The dinner was supposed to be a celebration. TechFlow had just closed a Series C funding round, $25 million from some Silicon Valley firm that specialized in disrupting legacy industries. Eric was glowing, surrounded by his team of 20-something developers in their designer sneakers and startup t-shirts, talking about machine learning and artificial intelligence like they were ancient gods who just discovered fire. I waited for the right moment. After the speeches and the toasts and the presentations about quarterly growth metrics. When the conversation turned to challenges and future planning, I cleared my throat and spoke up. Eric, I said, loud enough for the table to hear but not loud enough to interrupt other conversations, I've been looking at your platform architecture, and I think there might be some opportunities to improve reliability. The table went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of people listening, but the awkward quiet of people who just witnessed someone commit a social faux pas. Eric's smile didn't change, but I saw something shift behind his eyes. Something cold and dismissive. "Oh really, Dad?" he said, and there was an edge to his voice that made my stomach clench. "And what exactly do you think we're missing?" I should have stopped there. Should have recognized the warning signs, the body language, the tone that said this conversation was already over before it started. But I pressed on, because I genuinely believed I had something valuable to offer. "Redundancy," I said, pulling out a napkin and sketching a quick diagram. "You're running everything through single points of failure. If one component goes down, you lose everything. But if you build and back up systems, secondary pathways, you can maintain service even when individual elements fail." I was explaining it the way I would to a client, with the kind of patient detail that had served me well for 4 decades. But as I talked, I could see Eric's expression changing. The polite interest faded, replaced by something that looked like embarrassment. Like I was the crazy uncle at Thanksgiving who'd started talking about conspiracy theories and alien abductions. "Dad," he interrupted, and his voice cut through my explanation like a knife through paper. "It's not 1995 anymore." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Around the table, conversation stopped. Heads turned. Eric's entire team was watching now, waiting to see how this played out. "We don't need slide rules and graph paper to solve problems," he continued, his voice getting louder, more confident, like he was giving a presentation to investors. "We have machine learning algorithms that can optimize systems faster than you can even understand them. We have predictive analytics that prevent failures before they happen. We have cloud infrastructure that scales automatically based on demand." Then came the laugh. God, that laugh. Not a polite chuckle or a nervous giggle, but a full-throated laugh that cut through the restaurant noise like a chainsaw through silence. Rich and dismissive and cruel in a way that only family can be cruel to each other. "I mean, seriously," he said, still laughing, gesturing to his team like they were all in on some private joke. "You're talking about redundancy and fail-safes like we're building steam engines. This is modern software, Dad. It's self-healing, self-optimizing, self-scaling. The whole point is that we don't need ancient engineering principles because we've evolved beyond them." I felt every eye in that restaurant burning into me, watching the old man get educated by his successful son. The humiliation hit me like a physical blow, starting in my chest and radiating outward until my hands were shaking and my vision was blurring around the edges. Here I was, trying to bridge the gap between us, trying to contribute something meaningful to his success, and he was treating me like I'd suggested we go back to using abacuses and carrier pigeons. His team was nodding along, some of them smirking, all of them united in their certainty that the old ways were obsolete and the new ways were inherently superior. To them, I wasn't a veteran engineer with 4 decades of experience. I was a dinosaur who didn't understand that the meteor had already hit. "The thing about your generation, Dad," Eric continued, and now he was really warming to his theme, playing to his audience like a comedian who'd found his rhythm, "is that you think everything has to be built like it's going to last forever. But that's not how innovation works. You have to move fast, break things, iterate quickly. If you're not failing fast, you're failing slowly." I tried to respond, to explain that some things should be built to last, that reliability isn't the enemy of innovation but its foundation. But my voice came out as a croak, barely audible over the restaurant noise and the blood pounding in my ears. "I just thought," I started. "That's the problem," Eric cut me off. "You're thinking like an engineer when you should be thinking like an entrepreneur. You're worried about what might go wrong instead of focused on what could go right." I swallowed my pride, tasted like ashes and regret in 43 years of expertise being dismissed as irrelevant nostalgia. I folded the napkin with my diagram, put it in my pocket, and stood up from the table. "You're right," I said quietly. "I should go." And I left. Walked out of that restaurant like a ghost, invisible and irrelevant and completely defeated. Behind me, I could hear the conversation resuming, the laughter returning, my son and his team moving on as if I'd never been there at all. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and stop signs and the kind of rage that burns cold instead of hot. Not just anger at Eric, but at myself. For thinking I could contribute, for believing that experience mattered in a world that worshipped youth, for imagining that my son might actually want his father's advice. I parked in my garage and sat there in the darkness, surrounded by the tools and projects and remnants of a career that apparently meant nothing anymore. Old blueprints yellowed with age, prototypes that had never made it to production, awards and certifications that testified to expertise nobody valued. That's when I saw them, the sketches. Tucked into a folder behind my workbench, designs I'd been tinkering with in my spare time. Ideas for improving industrial automation, for making manufacturing processes more efficient and reliable. Nothing revolutionary, just solid engineering applied to real problems. The kind of work that had defined my career but apparently had no place in Eric's shiny new world. I pulled out those sketches and spread them across my workbench, studying them in the harsh fluorescent light. And I whispered to those dusty papers, to the ghosts of projects past and the dreams of projects future, "Let's see what the old man can still build." At midnight, exactly midnight, because sometimes the most important decisions come in the darkest hours when you're stripped of all illusions and forced to confront who you really are, I went to my computer and registered a company name, Ironbridge Systems. Because iron doesn't break under pressure. It gets stronger. And bridges connect things that are separated, span gaps that seem impossible to cross, carry loads that would crush lesser materials. What happened next was both the most humbling and the most determined period of my life. I threw myself into learning everything I'd dismissed as noise for the past decade. JavaScript frameworks with names like React and Angular and Vue. Cloud architecture concepts like microservices and containerization and serverless computing. API design principles, user experience methodologies, agile development practices that seemed designed to give engineers heart attacks. The learning curve was brutal. Steeper than any mountain I'd ever tried to climb. I'd sit at my computer for 12, 14, 16 hours straight, trying to understand concepts that came naturally to people a third my age. My eyes burned from staring at screens, my back ached from hunching over keyboards, my brain felt like it was going to explode from the constant influx of new information. I failed spectacularly and repeatedly. My first attempt at building a website looked like something from 1995, which, given Eric's comment, was probably fitting. Tables for layout, animated GIFs, color schemes that would have been garish in a carnival funhouse. I wrote code that worked about as well as a chocolate teapot, creating infinite loops that crashed my computer and database queries that would have taken hours to execute if I'd been foolish enough to let them run. There were nights I wanted to throw my laptop through the window and go back to collecting my pension in peace. Nights when I questioned my sanity, my motivation, my stubborn refusal to accept that maybe Eric was right and I really was obsolete. The technology moved so fast, changed so quickly, evolved in directions I couldn't predict or understand. But every time I hit a wall, every time I wanted to quit, I heard that laugh echoing in my head. That dismissive, patronizing sound that said I was finished, obsolete, a has-been who should know his place and stay there. And the anger would surge again, clean and focused and powerful enough to carry me through another 16-hour learning session. That's when Lena came back into my life like an answer to a prayer I hadn't known I was praying. We'd worked together 15 years ago on a municipal infrastructure project, upgrading the traffic management system for the entire Portland metro area. Brilliant woman, probably the best systems analyst I'd ever met. She had this rare combination of technical expertise and practical wisdom, could see both the forest and the trees, understood how individual components fit into larger systems without losing sight of the human beings who had to use them. Lena had gone freelance after getting tired of corporate politics and glass ceilings and the exhausting necessity of proving herself over and over again to bosses who were younger, less experienced, and infinitely more confident than she was. When I reached out to her, explained what I was trying to do, she agreed to mentor me. Not out of pity, Lena didn't do pity, but because she believed that experience combined with new tools could create something powerful. Daniel, she told me during one of our coffee meetings at a little place downtown where the baristas had probably never heard of Eric or TechFlow or the entire startup ecosystem that ruled our city, your problem isn't that you don't understand technology. It's that you think technology has replaced the fundamentals. It hasn't. Good engineering is still good engineering, whether you're building a bridge or building software. She was right, of course. The tools had changed, but the principles remained the same. You still needed to understand load and stress and failure points. You still needed to plan for the worst case, not just the best case. You still needed to build foundations that could support whatever weight you planned to put on them, plus a safety margin for the unexpected loads that always came sooner or later. But understanding the principles and implementing them were two different things entirely. I funded Ironbridge with my pension money, every dollar I'd saved for retirement, every cent I'd planned to live on for the next 20 years. Sarah would have called me crazy. She probably would have been right. But I needed to prove something, to Eric, to myself, to everyone who thought my time was over. The first prototype was a disaster. Complete, unmitigated, spectacular failure that crashed harder than a house of cards in a hurricane. I'd tried to build an industrial monitoring system, something that could track equipment performance and predict maintenance needs. The concept was sound. I'd designed similar systems for decades using proprietary hardware and custom software. But translating that expertise into modern web technologies was like trying to write poetry in a language I'd only started learning. The user interface was clunky and confusing. The database design was inefficient to the point of being unusable. The real-time monitoring features worked about as well as a sundial in a cave. I demonstrated it to myself one evening, watched it struggle to update a simple dashboard for 30 seconds before giving up and displaying an error message that might as well have said, "Old man doesn't understand computers." I almost quit right there. Almost admitted that maybe Eric was right, maybe I was just an old fool trying to play in a young man's game. I sat in my garage at 2 in the morning, staring at that failed prototype on my laptop screen, feeling every one of my 61 years like a weight on my shoulders. Then the phone rang. It was Marcus Chen, a client from my old engineering firm. Haven't talked to him in 3 years, but somehow he'd heard through the industry grapevine that I was doing something new. Marcus ran operations for Pacific Industrial, one of the largest manufacturing companies on the West Coast. They made everything from automotive components to aerospace parts, and they ran their facilities with the kind of precision that comes from understanding that a single equipment failure could shut down an entire production line for days. "Daniel," he said, his voice carrying the stress of someone who'd been fighting fires all week, "we need someone who still understands real engineering. These tech companies are all flash and no substance. They promise the moon but can't deliver a working streetlight. Are you available?" I took that contract like a drowning man grabs a life preserver. And for the first time in months, I felt like myself again. This wasn't about learning their language, it was about applying my language to their problems. Marcus didn't care if I used the latest JavaScript framework or the most cutting-edge cloud platform. He cared about results. He needed systems that worked reliably, efficiently, and predictably, because his business depended on machines that couldn't afford to fail. I built a small team of what I called industry veterans. People who'd been pushed aside by the youth movement but still had fire in their bellies and decades of hard-won expertise in their heads. Engineers in their 50s and 60s who understood that reliability isn't sexy but it's absolutely essential. Programmers who'd been coding since before the internet existed and knew how to write software that didn't need constant updates and patches and emergency fixes. We weren't the fastest team in the industry. We didn't promise to disrupt anything or revolutionize everything. But we were the most thorough. We didn't overpromise because we'd learned through bitter experience what happens when you commit to deadlines you can't meet or features you can't deliver. We documented everything, tested everything twice, and built systems that worked exactly as advertised from day one. Then Marcus dropped the bombshell that changed everything. "Just so you know," he said during one of our progress meetings, leaning back in his chair with the weary satisfaction of someone who'd finally found a solution to a problem that had been driving him crazy, "we were working with your son's company before this. TechFlow Solutions. Brilliant presentations, impressive demos, all the latest buzzwords and technologies. But when it came time to deliver..." He shook his head and laughed, but it wasn't the cruel laugh Eric had given me. It was the tired laugh of someone who'd been burned by promises that turned out to be vapor. They overpromised and underdelivered. "That's why we came to you." Eric had lost this client. My own son's company, with all its venture capital and artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms, had failed to serve someone who then turned to his father. The irony was so sharp it could cut glass, so perfect it felt like the universe was trying to tell me something. What went wrong? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Everything they showed us looked great in demos, Marcus explained. Slick interfaces, real-time dashboards, predictive analytics that promised to prevent problems before they happened. But when we tried to implement it in our actual facilities, with our actual equipment and our actual production schedules, he shrugged. It couldn't handle the complexity. Too many variables, too many edge cases they hadn't considered. The system would work fine for a few hours, maybe even a few days, then crash spectacularly and take half our production line with it. I nodded, understanding completely. It was the same problem I'd seen in every industry I'd ever worked in, the difference between laboratory conditions and real-world chaos. You could build something that worked perfectly in a controlled environment, but the moment you exposed it to the messy reality of actual use, all those elegant algorithms and sophisticated features collapsed under the weight of variables no one had thought to consider. They kept promising fixes, Marcus continued. Updates and patches and version 2.0 that would solve everything. But we couldn't afford to keep being their beta testers. We needed something that worked right the first time. Word started spreading through industry networks that Ironbridge delivered results quietly. Not through social media campaigns or conference presentations or thought leadership articles, but through the oldest form of marketing in the world, satisfied customers telling other customers about solutions that actually solved their problems. No flashy marketing campaigns, no disruptive innovation buzzwords, no promises to revolutionize entire industries. Just solid work that solved real problems for real people. While other companies were chasing the next big thing, we were perfecting the current necessary thing. While they were disrupting and innovating and transforming, we were delivering and maintaining and supporting. I watched Eric's company from a distance, following their press releases and social media updates with the kind of morbid fascination you might have for a car accident happening in slow motion. They were moving fast and breaking things, as the tech world loves to say, but they weren't fixing what they broke. They were leaving a trail of disappointed clients and unfinished projects, all hidden behind a veneer of innovation and disruption and forward-thinking leadership. My approach was the opposite in every way. Slow precision instead of flashy chaos. We tested everything twice, documented everything thoroughly, and treated every client like they were building something that needed to last 50 years instead of 50 weeks. Because that's how you build trust. That's how you build a reputation that survives the latest trend and the next big thing and the inevitable cycle of boom and bust that defines the technology industry. Then Eric lost a major investor. I heard about it through industry channels. The startup world is smaller than people think, especially when you've been around as long as I have and know people at every level of every company worth knowing. Meridian Ventures pulled out of TechFlow's Series D round, citing execution concerns and delivery challenges in their official statement. The real story, which I heard from a friend who worked in venture capital, was much more damaging. TechFlow had promised Meridian that their platform could handle enterprise-scale deployments, but when one of Meridian's portfolio companies tried to implement it, the system couldn't handle the load. Servers crashed, data was corrupted, and the client lost 3 days of production trying to get everything back online. Eric blamed market conditions, blamed timing, blamed the volatility of the venture capital ecosystem and the unrealistic expectations of investors who didn't understand the complexity of building enterprise software. He blamed everything except the fundamental problem: his company was building castles in the air instead of foundations on solid ground. That's when the journalist found me. Sarah Martinez from TechCrunch. Bright, sharp, probably younger than Eric but with the kind of curiosity that makes great reporters. She was writing a piece about veteran entrepreneurs, people who were starting companies later in life and proving that innovation wasn't just a young person's game. Somehow Ironbridge had caught her attention, maybe because we were getting results without generating the kind of hype that usually attracts media coverage. The comeback founder outperforming startups half his age, she called it. The article was everything I hadn't known I wanted: recognition without exaggeration, praise without hyperbole, an honest assessment of what we'd built and why it mattered. She interviewed our clients, documented our approach, explained our philosophy in terms that both engineers and business people could understand. The story hit the internet like lightning striking dry timber. My phone started ringing non-stop with interview requests, partnership offers, investment proposals from venture capital firms who suddenly realized that maybe experience was an asset instead of a liability. Major publications wanted to follow up, conference organizers invited me to speak, industry analysts added Ironbridge to their reports on emerging trends in enterprise technology. For the first time in 3 years, since Sarah's death and Eric's dismissal and the long slide into irrelevance, I felt essential again. Not just relevant, essential. Like the world needed what I had to offer, valued what I'd learned, respected the expertise I'd spent 4 decades accumulating. Eric saw the article. Of course he did. Everyone in our industry saw it. TechCrunch might as well have sent him a personal copy with a note that said, "Your father is outperforming you." And that's when he realized who was behind Ironbridge Systems. Not some mysterious new competitor or well-funded startup, but his father. The outdated relic he'd laughed at in that restaurant. The old man who supposedly didn't understand modern technology or contemporary business practices. He came to my office like a storm front moving in from the coast, all fury and indignation and wounded pride. Burst through the door without an appointment, without calling, like he owned the place and everyone in it. "You stole my clients," he accused, his face red with rage and something that might have been fear. I looked up from my desk, where I'd been reviewing architectural diagrams for a new industrial monitoring system, and felt a strange calm settle over me like snow falling on angry water. "I served them when you stopped listening," I said. "This is my industry, Dad. My generation built this. We created the platforms and the frameworks and the entire ecosystem that makes any of this possible. You have no right to come in here and undermine everything we've created." I set down my pen and really looked at him. Saw the expensive suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month, the designer shoes, the smartwatch that could do everything except teach its wearer wisdom. But underneath all that success and sophistication, I saw the same insecurity that had driven him since childhood, the need to prove he was smarter, faster, better than everyone around him, especially his old man. "Your generation built platforms," I told him, keeping my voice level and calm. "My generation built foundations. Guess which one lasts longer?" That hit him like a slap. His whole body tensed, his hands clenched into fists, and I could see him struggling with the urge to say something he might regret later. "You don't understand what you're interfering with," he said, his voice dropping to the dangerous quiet that means someone is fighting to control their temper. "TechFlow isn't just my company. It's the livelihood of 67 employees. It's contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. It's innovation that could change entire industries. And you're undermining all of that because of some petty grudge about a comment I made at dinner." "A comment?" I stood up from my desk, and I could feel 4 decades of suppressed frustration rising in my chest like flood water behind a failing dam. "You humiliated me, Eric. In front of your entire team, in a room full of people who respected your success, you made me look like a fool for trying to help you." "I was protecting my business," he shot back. "You were suggesting solutions to problems we'd already solved, offering advice based on technologies that are decades out of date. What was I supposed to do, nod politely and let my team think their CEO's father knows better than they do?" "You were supposed to listen," I said, and my voice cracked on the word. "You were supposed to consider that maybe, just maybe, someone who's been building things since before you were born might have something valuable to contribute." He was shaking with anger now, all pretense of calm control abandoned. "If you want war, Dad," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut steel, "you've got one. War. My own son declared war on me because I'd proven that experience and wisdom still mattered in his precious digital world. Because I'd shown that the fundamentals he dismissed as obsolete were actually more important than ever, especially when you were trying to build something that needed to work reliably instead of just looking impressive in demonstrations. What followed was the ugliest period of my professional life, maybe the ugliest period of any part of my life since Sarah's diagnosis. Eric unleashed everything his company had on me like he was trying to destroy a competitor instead of competing with his father. Corporate espionage, data leaks, whisper campaigns, negative reviews from fake accounts, lawsuits threatened but never filed because his lawyers knew they had no case. They spread rumors that Ironbridge was using outdated methods, that our systems weren't secure, that we were just riding a wave of nostalgia from clients who didn't understand modern technology. They hired digital marketing firms to create negative content about us, paid influencers to question our approach, even went so far as to create fake social media accounts that posted detailed criticism of our methods. The smear campaign was sophisticated and relentless and ultimately effective. My main contract, the one with Marcus Chen that had given me credibility, that had proven what we could do when we focused on results instead of hype, got cancelled after Pacific Industrial received an anonymous tip that Ironbridge's systems had security vulnerabilities that could expose their entire network to cyber attacks. The tip was false, the vulnerabilities were fabricated, but the damage was done. Marcus called me personally to apologize, explained that his board of directors couldn't afford to take any risks with cybersecurity, especially after several high-profile breaches in the manufacturing sector. He knew the accusations were probably baseless, but he couldn't stake his career on probably. I was devastated. Sitting in my office at midnight, watching everything I'd rebuilt crumble around me like a sandcastle in a rising tide. The other contracts started falling away too, as clients decided they couldn't afford to be associated with a company that might be a security risk. Even Lena questioned whether it was worth continuing. "Daniel," she said gently during what might have been our last meeting, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too many good people destroyed by forces beyond their control, "maybe it's time to consider that some battles aren't meant to be fought. You've proven your point. You've shown you can compete with companies a fraction of your age. Maybe that's enough." But it wasn't enough. Not even close. Because this wasn't about proving I could compete. This was about proving that integrity and experience and dedication to doing things right still mattered in a world that seemed to value speed over substance, hype over results, promises over performance. I drove to Sarah's grave that night, through empty streets slick with October rain, past the closed shops and darkened office buildings of a city that never quite slept but sometimes pretended to rest. Sat in the darkness beside her headstone and told her everything. How I'd wanted Eric to respect me, not hate me. How I'd tried to build a bridge between us and instead had blown it up completely, leaving us on opposite sides of a chasm that seemed to grow wider every day. I wanted him to see that his old man still had something to offer. I whispered to the cold granite that bore her name and the dates that bracketed a life cut too short. Instead, I turned him into an enemy. What kind of father does that? What kind of man destroys his relationship with his only child just to prove a point about engineering principles? The wind moved through the cemetery trees, carrying the smell of rain and fallen leaves and the kind of loneliness that comes from talking to stones instead of people. I sat there until dawn, until the groundskeepers arrived and the early visitors began their pilgrimages to their own losses, and I still didn't have an answer. The next morning, Lena called with news that changed everything. She'd been digging into the data breach that had led to our contract cancellation, following digital breadcrumbs that most people wouldn't even know to look for. Lena had skills that went beyond normal systems analysis. She understood how information flowed through networks, how data could be intercepted and modified and weaponized by people who knew what they were doing. "Daniel," she said, and I could hear the excitement in her voice, the satisfaction of a puzzle finally solved, "you need to see this. Eric's CFO leaked your internal data. We have the proof." She'd found the digital fingerprints, the metadata trails, the electronic smoking gun that showed exactly how our confidential information had ended up in the wrong hands. It was all there in server logs and email headers and the kind of technical evidence that would hold up in court if we chose to pursue it. Tommy Nguyen, Eric's chief financial officer, had accessed Ironbridge's client database through a security vulnerability that he'd planted during a consultation meeting where he'd offered to help us improve our cybersecurity. He'd downloaded our client list, our project specifications, our internal communications, everything he needed to craft targeted attacks against our credibility. It would have been easy to retaliate. So easy. We had evidence of corporate espionage, data theft, conspiracy to interfere with business relationships. We could have destroyed Eric's company overnight, sent Tommy to prison, made headlines that would have followed them for the rest of their careers. Instead, I made a different choice. I published everything publicly. Not as an attack, but as transparency. Every process we used, every method we developed, every lesson we'd learned from 43 years of building things that lasted. I opened our books, showed our work, demonstrated exactly how we delivered results. It was the opposite of corporate secrecy. It was radical honesty in an industry built on mystique and proprietary algorithms and trade secrets that often turned out to be common knowledge dressed up in fancy packaging. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Clients who'd been scared away by the rumors came back, apologizing for doubting us, eager to work with a company that was willing to show them exactly what they were paying for. New clients appeared who were drawn to our transparency, tired of dealing with vendors who treated their methods like state secrets and their algorithms like religious mysteries. But more importantly, regulators noticed. When you publish everything and invite scrutiny, and when your competitor's response is to hide behind legal threats and non-disclosure agreements, it becomes pretty obvious who has something to hide and who's operating with genuine integrity. The Federal Trade Commission opened an investigation into TechFlow's business practices. The Securities and Exchange Commission started asking questions about their financial reporting and investor communications. State attorneys general began examining their client contracts for deceptive practices and unfulfilled promises. The investigation into Eric's firm started quietly, but it moved fast once the regulators realized what they were dealing with. Financial irregularities that had been hidden in complex accounting structures. Data privacy violations that affected thousands of users. Investor fraud in the form of demonstrations that showed capabilities the software didn't actually possess. Contract violations where they'd promised features that didn't exist and performance levels they couldn't achieve. All the chickens came home to roost at once, like a biblical plague of consequences that had been building for years. Eric's board forced emergency meetings, his investors fled like rats from a sinking ship, and suddenly the disruptive young visionary looked more like a cautionary tale about what happens when you prioritize growth over governance, hype over substance, speed over integrity. The final confrontation happened in the same restaurant where this all started. Meridian, where the waiters still wore designer jeans and explained each dish like they were unveiling works of art, where the prices were still ridiculous and the portions were still tiny. Poetic justice, or maybe just coincidence, but Eric asked to meet me there. He walked in looking defeated, older than his 34 years, carrying the weight of a company that was hemorrhaging money and credibility like a ship with holes in every compartment. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by the hunched shoulders and downcast eyes of someone who'd finally realized that the world wasn't going to bend to his will just because he wanted it to. "You destroyed me," he said, slumping into the chair across from me like a man whose bones had turned to lead. I looked at my son, really looked at him for the first time in years, and saw not the arrogant executive who'd laughed at me, but the scared little boy who used to ask me to fix his broken toys and explain how things worked and promise him that everything would be okay even when I wasn't sure it would be. "No, son," I said quietly, my voice carrying none of the anger or vindication I'd expected to feel at this moment. "I showed you what integrity builds. I had the merger documents ready. My lawyers had been working on them for weeks, crafting a deal that would allow Ironbridge to absorb TechFlow, assume its debts, honor its contracts, and try to salvage what could be saved from the wreckage. It wasn't a hostile takeover, it was a rescue operation, an attempt to save 67 jobs and hundreds of client relationships from the consequences of decisions that had prioritized short-term gains over long-term sustainability. But instead of firing him, instead of completing his humiliation by making him a casualty of his own poor judgment, I offered him something else. Something that surprised both of us. "Let's rebuild the right way," I said, sliding the documents across the table. "Together." It took months to repair the damage. Months of long days and difficult conversations and the slow, patient work of rebuilding trust with clients who'd been burned by promises that turned out to be empty. We had to restructure the entire company, replace systems that had been built for demonstration rather than operation, retrain employees who'd learned to overpromise because that's what the culture rewarded. Eric and I worked side by side through all of it, and slowly, painfully slowly, like bones healing after a break, we started to understand each other again. He learned that experience isn't the enemy of innovation but its foundation, that the best new ideas are built on principles that have been tested by time and proven under pressure. I learned that new tools and new methods could amplify good engineering rather than replace it, that the future belonged to people who could combine the wisdom of experience with the possibilities of technology. We built something stronger together than either of us could have built alone. Ironbridge 2.0 became a different kind of company, one that valued reliability as much as innovation, sustainability as much as growth, integrity as much as profit. We hired engineers of all ages, from recent graduates to industry veterans, and created a culture where experience was respected and new ideas were welcomed. We launched a mentorship fund for founders over 50, because there are thousands of people out there who've been written off, dismissed, treated like their decades of experience are worthless in the face of the next hot trend. They're not obsolete. They're essential. They're the people who understand that building something that lasts requires more than enthusiasm and venture capital. It requires wisdom, patience, and the kind of deep knowledge that only comes from making mistakes and learning from them. Eric apologized, eventually. Not in some grand gesture or public statement, but in the quiet moments when we were working late and the office was empty and the only sound was the hum of computers running systems that actually worked the way they were supposed to work. "I was scared, Dad," he admitted one night, looking up from code that we'd been debugging together. "Scared that if I admitted you knew things I didn't, if I acknowledged that experience mattered, it would mean I wasn't as smart as I thought I was. That maybe I'd been fooling myself about my own abilities. Intelligence isn't about knowing everything," I told him. "It's about knowing what you don't know and being humble enough to learn from people who do. We're building something now that neither of us could have imagined when we were at war with each other. A company that combines the best of both worlds, the energy and creativity of youth with the wisdom and patience of experience. Our employees range from 22 to 68, and they learn from each other in ways that make both generations stronger." Eric called me outdated, laughed at me like I was some relic from a bygone era who didn't understand that everything had changed. Turns out experience ages like iron, it gets stronger under pressure. The heat that's supposed to destroy it just makes it more resilient, more valuable, more capable of bearing weight when everything else gives way. I'm 61 years old. I was supposed to be retired, irrelevant, content with my memories and my pension and the gradual fade into invisibility that society expects from people my age. Instead, I'm running a company that's changing how this industry thinks about reliability, mentoring the next generation of entrepreneurs, and working alongside my son to build something that matters. Something that will last longer than the next funding cycle or the latest trend or the quarterly earnings report. They can count you out. They can dismiss your experience, mock your methods, treat you like yesterday's news gathering dust in tomorrow's archive. But they can't stop you from proving them wrong. They can't stop you from showing them that wisdom and dedication and the courage to do things right will always matter, no matter how fast the world spins or how loud the voices that say you're finished. The young wolves think they own the future because they understand the tools. They're wrong. The future belongs to anyone brave enough to seize it, experienced enough to build it right, and stubborn enough to never give up. Age isn't a limitation, it's ammunition. Experience isn't obsolete, it's essential. And the bridge between what was and what could be isn't built by dismissing the past, but by combining its wisdom with the present's possibilities. If this story reminded you that it's never too late to prove them wrong, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and tell me what country you're watching from. I read every single comment, because every person who refuses to be written off is part of this movement. Every person who chooses substance over flash, who builds for the long term instead of the quick win, who refuses to let age be an excuse for irrelevance. The future isn't owned by the young or the old. It's owned by the persistent, the principled, and the people who understand that the best innovations are built on foundations that can bear the weight of time. Don't let them tell you your time is over. Your time is just beginning.